They say the world is rich beyond measure, but tell me, how can that be when every nation on earth is drowning in debt? The United States owes $38 trillion. Japanovesnina, Europe, 14, even the oil kingdoms, Saudi Arabia, the shining towers of Dubai, even they too owe. So here's the question no one dares to ask aloud. If everyone is in debt, who is the lender? Tonight, we're not just talking about money. We're peeling back the skin of civilization itself to see the invisible scaffolding of promises, of trust, of fear that holds this world together. Imagine this: a farmer lends his neighbor a sack of grain. Centuries later, a government borrows trillions it can never repay. The same story, only written with bigger numbers and smaller hearts. You sit here thinking you own your savings, your job, your future. But what if everything you have is simply someone else's debt wrapped in faith and printed ink? The world sleeps under the illusion of wealth. Yet somewhere behind every transaction, there's a quiet ticking sound, the heartbeat of a system built not on gold, but on belief. Tonight, let's follow that sound together to find out who truly owns the world and what happens when the debt that built our dreams finally comes due. You and I have been taught to think of debt as a mistake, a burden to be escaped, a sign of failure. But what if debt isn't the symptom, it's the system itself? To understand the machinery that rules our lives, we have to go back not a decade, not a century, but to the moment the world discovered how to turn debt into power. It began, as most revolutions do, with a war. The year was 1694. England was bleeding treasure fighting France. The king's coffers were empty, his soldiers unpaid, his ships decaying in port. Gold, once the measure of a kingdom's strength, had run dry. Then came the idea that would rewrite the future. If the crown could not borrow from other kings, it would borrow from its own merchants. A group of London traders offered the king a loan vast enough to fund cannons, ships, and men on one condition. The loan would be guaranteed not by the monarch's fortune, but by the taxes of the unborn. Future generations would pay today's war. And to manage this impossible promise, they built an institution, the Bank of England. That single creation changed everything. For the first time, a government could spend money it did not yet have. For the first time, debt became the bloodstream of empire. The merchants received something extraordinary in return: a piece of paper stamped with the royal seal, a promise to pay interest forever. It was called a government bond. That slip of paper, flimsy, forgettable, and faith based, was the seed from which our entire global financial system would grow. France copied it, the Netherlands perfected it. The newborn United States adopted it to fight the British themselves. In time, every empire learned the same dark lesson: to rule the world, you must borrow it first. And so the balance sheet replaced the battlefield. For centuries, kings had conquered land to mine gold. Now nations issued paper to mine belief. Fast forward 200 years, the wars grew bigger, the promises heavier. The 20th century brought industrialized destruction, two world wars that demanded debts beyond imagination. Nations borrowed not millions, but billions, then trillions, to fund the apocalypse and rebuild what they had destroyed. In 1944, inside a small resort in Bretton Woods, the victors of World War II designed a new world order. The US dollar, then redeemable for gold, became the beating heart of global trade. But gold has limits, ambition does not. As the decades passed, America printed more dollars than gold it owned. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, the arithmetic no longer worked. Then came 1971. A single decision, one quiet announcement from President Nixon severed the dollar from gold forever. The Nixon shock, money was no longer a thing, it became a story. Its value now depended entirely on faith in governments, in banks, in us. From that day forward, debt had no ceiling. If money could be created by decree, then every loan, every bond, every promise could stretch infinitely as long as people kept believing, and believe they did. Governments borrowed to build highways and armies, corporations borrowed to expand, families borrowed to survive. The world became addicted to tomorrow's money. Debt stopped being a danger, it became oxygen. But hidden beneath this miracle of growth lies a quiet absurdity. The debt was never meant to be repaid. When a government bond reaches maturity, the state does not empty its treasury to pay it back. It issues a new bond, borrowing anew to pay the old. It rolls the debt forward endlessly, like a wave that never reaches shore. That's the secret. No one tells you sovereign debt is not a temporary inconvenience, it is a permanent feature. Every interest payment becomes someone else's income. Every deficit becomes someone else's asset. The world owes itself and feeds on itself in a loop so vast that even economists call it self referential. Money, in this light, is nothing more than circulating faith. When you hold a dollar, you are holding a fragment of collective trust, a symbol that others too will keep believing. But what happens when belief begins to fade? Think of it like this: the global economy is a cathedral built not of stone, but of stories. Each bond, each credit, each currency, a brick of narrative holding the structure together. Remove belief, and the walls vanish into dust. Yet, for 3 centuries, this illusion has held firm not because it is true, but because it is shared. This is why economists call debt sovereign. It rules over nations, not the other way around. The paradox deepens. The more a country borrows, the more powerful it becomes. Its bonds flood the world, turning debt into demand, demand into strength, and strength into the very thing that sustains confidence. A nation's ability to borrow is its credibility. That's why America, with $38 trillion of IOUs, remains the most trusted borrower on earth. The debt isn't a weakness, it's proof that the world still believes. But belief is fragile. In this paradoxical universe, the line between wealth and ruin is measured not in gold, but in perception. The moment the crowd doubts, the system trembles. To keep the illusion alive, central banks learned a new magic trick. They no longer waited for money to arrive, they created it out of nothing. Quantitative easing, they called it, a polite phrase for conjuring liquidity. The Federal Reserve buys government bonds with money that didn't exist the second before. The liability of one balance sheet becomes the asset of another, and the cycle continues. Debt begets money. Money begets more debt. It's a self feeding serpent devouring its own tail. And still, we celebrate it as progress. This is the world we live in, where every skyscraper, every hospital, every startup, and every paycheck traces its roots back to a promise that will never be fulfilled. When you look at your savings account, your pension fund, your insurance policy, you're not holding wealth, you're holding someone else's obligation. It's breathtaking, isn't it? How something so fragile, so absurd, could hold 8 billion lives together. But that is the genius and the tragedy of modern finance. We no longer live under kings who mint coins of gold. We live under systems that mint confidence. Every crisis, every boom, every headline of growth or recession, every election and policy speech, they're all rituals performed to maintain faith in an idea that cannot die without taking us with it. And that, my friend, is the paradox at the heart of our civilization. Debt is both the poison and the cure, the sickness and the pulse, the shackle and the engine that moves us forward. Faith can move mountains, they say. But in the markets, when faith falters, those mountains collapse. Every empire has its earthquake, and ours will not be made of stone, but of numbers. You can already hear the first cracks. Governments borrowing to pay yesterday's bills, central banks printing money to buy their own promises, corporations drowning in cheap credit, households paying rent with credit cards. The rhythm of debt, once the pulse of growth, begins to sound like arrhythmia. In America, the interest on its national debt now costs more each year than the entire military budget. Imagine that the price of simply keeping promises surpasses the price of defending the nation itself. In Japan, the debt has ballooned beyond 250% of GDP. In Europe, countries like Italy and France fight to convince investors they can still afford to exist. And in China, the dragon's roar is muffled beneath a mountain of shadow bank loans and unfinished cities, ghostly towers that no one can afford to live in. Everywhere you look, the numbers swell like floodwater behind a dam built of trust. And when that trust leaks, the flood begins. It often starts quietly, a rumor, a downgrade from a credit agency, a sudden sell off, the tremor before the quake. The markets move faster than reason. Confidence can collapse in an afternoon. You may remember the autumn of 2022, the United Kingdom, birthplace of modern finance, brought to its knees by its own experiment. A new government promised tax cuts and spending in the same breath. The markets, those invisible gods, laughed. They dumped British bonds, demanding higher yields. Mortgage rates doubled overnight. Pension funds imploded. Within days, the Bank of England had to intervene to save its own economy. Within weeks, the Prime Minister resigned. A $1 trillion empire undone by a few sentences and a moment of disbelief. That was not an isolated event, it was a warning. The world's faith in itself can shatter in seconds, not with bullets or bombs, but with a loss of confidence. You see, the real threat isn't a shortage of money, it's a shortage of belief. Once investors suspect a government might not pay its debts, they demand higher interest to lend. Those higher costs make the debt even harder to pay. So the government borrows more to cover them. And so the spiral begins, the death spiral, as economists whisper. Picture a man sinking in quicksand. Each movement he makes to escape only drags him deeper. That's the logic of sovereign debt. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on hospitals, schools, or roads. The economy slows, tax revenue falls, and the next year's deficit grows larger still. It's not a sudden explosion, it's slow suffocation, a quiet theft of the future. In desperate moments, nations reach for their last resort, the printing press. They tell their central banks to buy more bonds, to create more money. At first, it feels like magic problems vanish, salaries rise, stock markets boom, but the magic always fades. The prices rise faster than the wages. Inflation, that invisible tax, eats away at every paycheck, every savings account, every dream. You can't see it, but you feel it in the shrinking basket at the grocery store, in the rent you can't afford, in the future that seems to cost more every year. And when inflation turns to hyperinflation, the illusion burns. Look at Venezuela, where a lifetime of savings couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Look at Zimbabwe, where money was cheaper as wallpaper than currency. When trust dies, money dies with it. But there is a more subtle predator stalking the global economy, one you never vote for, never see, yet one that decides your mortgage rate, your job, even your government's survival. They are called the bond vigilantes. They are not a club or a secret cabal, but the collective force of markets, pension funds, hedge funds, insurers who lend to governments and judge their worthiness every second of every day. When they sense weakness, they strike. They sell your country's bonds, forcing yields to rise, interest payments to balloon. They do not shout, they do not warn, they simply withdraw belief, and that alone can topple nations. These vigilantes overthrew Liz Truss's government. They terrified Italy. They humiliated Greece. And they watch still from the shadows, waiting for the next tremor. Greece, 2010, a small country with ancient pride and modern debts. When the truth surfaced that its deficit was twice what it claimed, panic spread faster than the plague once did through its old ports. Banks froze. Unemployment soared above 25%. Families scavenged for food. A generation lost its youth paying for the lies of its elders. But Greece's tragedy wasn't confined to its borders. French and German banks held billions in Greek bonds. When Athens fell, Frankfurt trembled. Because when one nation defaults, its pain infects others. They call it contagion, a fitting word, because financial collapse spreads like disease. Each bond, each derivative, each swap of vein connecting one economy to another. When one heart stops beating, the rest feel the shock. And within this interconnected system lurks something even darker, the doom loop. Here's how it works: a government borrows money by selling bonds. Its banks buy those bonds because they're told government debt is the safest asset on earth. But when the government's finances falter, the bonds lose value, crippling the banks. Then the government must borrow more to rescue those same banks, which increases its debt, which weakens the bonds even further, which crushes the banks again. It's a perfect circle of destruction, a serpent devouring its own heart. Italy knows this loop. Spain has tasted it. The Eurozone has lived in its shadow for a decade. And when panic rises, the judgment comes. Credit rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, Standard and Poor's, appear like priests in the temple of money. They assign grades to every nation's soul. AAA for the virtuous, junk for the damned. A single downgrade can trigger chaos because millions of pension funds and insurance firms are forbidden to hold junk bonds. The moment a rating falls below that line, the exodus begins, forced selling, plunging prices, skyrocketing yields. It's not just a number, it's a death sentence. Even the United States, the world's financial center, felt that judgment in 2011. A political standoff over the debt ceiling made investors uneasy. Standard and Poor's downgraded US credit for the first time in history. The markets crashed. Confidence wavered. The world glimpsed what it would look like if the unthinkable happened, if the empire of debt began to doubt itself. Fear, you see, doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from understanding too much. We know now that every nation, every company, every family's security rests on a fragile belief that tomorrow will arrive with enough money to pay for today. But what if it doesn't? What if the music stops and the world discovers that the chairs were never real? Look around. Wars funded by deficits, pandemics financed by credit, industries propped up by central bank liquidity. Remove the debt, and everything from your paycheck to your pension vanishes like mist. So we keep believing because the alternative is unthinkable. We convince ourselves that growth will return, that inflation will fade, that central banks know what they're doing. We nod when they speak in calm technical language, quantitative tightening, fiscal prudence, monetary accommodation, euphemisms, all elegant disguise for fear. But deep down, we sense it. The system trembles. Every recession, every currency crisis, every sudden market shock is the same story told again. The story of a civilization that lives by borrowing its own breath. And somewhere beneath all the jargon and statistics lies a single chilling truth. This cannot last forever. You've heard the numbers: trillions, deficits, yields, spreads. But behind every number, there's a heartbeat. And behind every policy, a face you'll never see on a trading screen. Somewhere right now, a woman wakes before dawn. She ties her hair, packs her lunch in a small plastic box, and takes the same bus she's taken for 20 years. She doesn't think about government bonds or central banks. She only knows that her rent has doubled, that the price of rice rises faster than her wage, and that the money she saves each month buys less than it did before. She wonders quietly how a life so honest can feel so expensive. You might not know her name, but she carries the cost of the world's debt on her shoulders silently, invisibly. When markets crash, headlines speak of billions lost. But what they don't tell you is how it feels to lose a single paycheck. A father once proud sits at the dinner table avoiding his daughter's eyes. The factory he worked for closed last week, a downturn, they called it. Now he folds his hands over an empty bowl and says, it's just temporary, though he doesn't believe it. Outside, the rain keeps falling. Inside, the silence grows heavier. And far from the cities, where numbers mean little and faith still has the shape of the land, a farmer watches the clouds, waiting for rain that never comes. He used to sell his crops for enough to feed his family and repair the roof. Now the price he gets depends on currencies he's never touched, on contracts written in languages he'll never read. He is told that the market has shifted, that demand has fallen, that interest rates in some faraway capital have changed, as if his life were a figure on someone else's spreadsheet. He doesn't curse the world. He just bends down, plants another seed, and hopes next year will be kinder. He doesn't know it, but he too is part of the global debt, a creditor and a debtor at once, bound to a system he did not choose. You see, that's the quiet tragedy of our age. Most of us are paying for promises we never made. When a government borrows to fund its deficits, it does not borrow from thin air, it borrows from you, from your taxes, your labor, your time, every interest payment, every bailout, every stimulus package is drawn from the energy of people who wake up each day and keep the machine turning. It's an invisible tax, not written in law, but in exhaustion. In another corner of the world, a young couple tries to buy their first home. They've done everything right, studied hard, worked long hours, saved what little they could, but the house they could afford 10 years ago now costs triple. Every loan they apply for is denied. The bank clerk smiles politely and says, interest rates are rising. He doesn't look at their faces as they leave, two small figures fading into a city built for someone else. That city, bright, modern, efficient, isn't powered by innovation or freedom, but by debt. Every tower is mortgaged, every company leveraged, every dream borrowed from the future. And in that world of glass and steel, the people below carry the weight of promises made by those above. Sometimes you can feel it in the air, the tension between what's real and what's owed. The teacher grading papers late into the night, wondering why her pension fund keeps shrinking. The nurse finishing a double shift, not knowing her hospital is funded by bonds from a government already broke. The student signing a loan contract that will outlive her 20s, the small shop owner closing early because no one can afford his goods. These are not crises of money, they are crises of meaning. Because what is wealth if those who create it can no longer live with dignity? You might think this story is about governments or banks or systems too large to touch. But it's also about you, the hours you trade for a paycheck, the hope that tomorrow will justify today's fatigue, the quiet faith that the system will not forget you. Debt is not only a financial mechanism, it's an emotional one. It teaches obedience. It keeps us patient, afraid, grateful for what little remains. And in that obedience, the powerful find stability. They say the economy must tighten belts, but it's always the same belts that tighten around the same necks. When inflation hits, the rich call it market volatility. The poor call it hunger. When interest rates rise, investors say it's price discovery. Families call it eviction. When banks fail, politicians speak of moral hazard. But tell that to the child whose dinner disappears because her parents lost their jobs. Words can hide cruelty. Economics can disguise injustice. And yet, beneath all the jargon, what remains are people breathing, loving, enduring. Once in a small town, an old man listened to the radio every evening. He didn't understand the financial news, but he liked the voice, calm, distant, promising order. One night he heard the word recession. He asked his grandson what it meant. The boy thought for a while, then said, it means things are going to get harder, Grandpa. The old man nodded, turned off the radio, and went outside to water his dying plants. That's what recession means for most people. Not charts, not markets, just harder. And yet, amid the struggle, there's something else, a kind of quiet nobility. The way a mother still smiles at her child, the way a worker still shows up, the way a farmer still sows. even when the system forgets them. They carry the world not in theory, but in practice. They are the true creditors, lending their lives to the future without ever signing a contract. But no one thanks them. No one names a building after them. They simply endure because endurance is cheaper than rebellion. You, listening to this, are part of that endurance. Maybe you've worked hard your whole life and still feel behind. Maybe you've watched prices rise faster than your hope. Maybe you've wondered why you always seem to owe, even when you did nothing wrong. It's not your fault. It's the architecture of a world that measures success by debt. But remember this: even the most fragile system depends on something the markets can't quantify: your patience, your kindness, your persistence. Those are not liabilities. They are the last true assets humanity has. In the end, economics will always find a way to explain itself: graphs, theories, reforms, but the real story of debt is written in ordinary hearts. It's the mother counting coins by candlelight, the son wiring money home from another country, the teacher saving for a retirement that may never come, the millions who keep believing that someday all this sacrifice will mean something. Perhaps that belief, naive, uncalculated, is the only faith worth keeping, because it reminds us that beneath the towers of debt and the empires of interest, there are still human beings, and their worth cannot be measured in currency. I've spent years chasing answers, equations, theories, forecasts, believing that if I could just understand the numbers, I might understand the world. But somewhere between the graphs and the news tickers, I lost sight of something simpler: people. When I close my eyes, I still see their faces. The woman on the bus, the father at the empty table, the farmer staring at the sky, each one a fragment of a larger story, a civilization suspended between fear and faith. We call it the economy as if it were a machine, but I think it's more like a mirror. It reflects what we value, what we fear, what we choose to ignore. And when I look into that mirror tonight, I see a truth that makes me uneasy. The world is not collapsing because we lack money. It trembles because we've forgotten what money was meant to represent: trust, cooperation, care. I remember my grandmother's voice from years ago. She used to keep her savings in a tin box under the bed. Banks can fail, she said, but a promise kept never loses value. Back then, I thought she was superstitious. Now, I think she was an economist of the heart, because every financial system, no matter how sophisticated, rests on something profoundly human: belief that tomorrow will honor today. And when that belief erodes, no policy can save us. Maybe that's why crises hurt so deeply. They aren't just collapses of numbers, they are collapses of faith, a shared heartbreak disguised as statistics. Sometimes I walk through the city at night and watch the lights flicker in 1,000 windows. Each light a story: a family arguing over bills, a student awake over debt, a trader staring at a glowing screen. From above, it all looks beautiful, a constellation of human ambition. But beneath that beauty, I can almost hear a whisper: we are tired, we are afraid, we are still hoping. And yet, hope persists. It hides in small places, in the way strangers hold the door for each other, in the way someone shares bread with a neighbor, in the way a child laughs without knowing the price of anything. Perhaps that's what rescues us, not reform, not policy, but kindness. An unprofitable, inefficient, irrational kindness. When I think of debt now, I no longer imagine numbers. I imagine time, hours traded for survival, generations borrowing from those yet unborn. We call it growth. But sometimes I wonder, are we growing or just stretching the distance between our hearts? Maybe the real debt isn't financial at all. Maybe it's moral. A debt we owe to one another for the air we breathe, the labor we share, the world we inherit. I pour a cup of tea and listen to its gentle hiss. It reminds me how fragile balance is. Economies, like people, depend on rhythm: inhale, exhale, borrow, repay, hurt, heal. When the rhythm breaks, so does the song. And yet, the silence after the break is not empty. It's an invitation, a chance to listen, really listen to what the world has been trying to tell us. That maybe wealth is not the pile of coins we guard, but the circle of trust we build. That progress measured only in GDP is progress without direction. That a society obsessed with growth forgets how to rest. I once asked an old fisherman how he measured success. He smiled and said, "By the mornings I wake and the sea still lets me sail." There was wisdom in that, the humility of coexistence. He did not conquer the sea, he conversed with it. Perhaps economies should do the same, speak with life instead of over it. I think of the billions who will never read a balance sheet, yet live its consequences. They are the invisible pillars of this age, holding up towers they will never enter. And I wonder, if the scaffolding of our world is built on their labor, shouldn't the world at least honor their humanity? But honor, like credit, requires intention. It must be renewed every day, not through slogans, but through simple fairness, paying people what they deserve, listening when they speak, sharing when there's enough. That's the kind of economy I still want to believe in, one that measures not profit, but reciprocity. I don't know if we can reform the system. Maybe it's too vast, too tangled in its own logic, but we can reform the way we live within it. We can choose honesty over illusion. We can remember that efficiency without empathy is just another form of cruelty. We can teach our children that money is a tool, not a goal. And we can forgive ourselves for being human, for wanting security, for fearing loss, for believing in things that sometimes betray us. As I finish my tea, the first hint of dawn seeps through the window. The world is still in debt, yes, but it is also still breathing. And breath means possibility. I think about how every sunrise resets the balance sheet of the soul. Yesterday's mistakes don't vanish, but the light makes them easier to carry. Maybe that's all redemption really is: the courage to keep walking, to keep trying to understand, to keep believing that trust can be rebuilt one quiet act at a time. So tonight, if you feel small before the weight of the world's numbers, remember, the economy is not somewhere out there. It's here in your choices, your kindness, your patience, and maybe that's where healing begins. Not in policy, but in perspective. Not in markets, but in meaning. The night has lifted. For hours, I've spoken about debt, power, and belief, about a world spinning on invisible promises. But as the sun climbs, the numbers fade, and what remains is something gentler, a realization. All this time, I thought the story was about money. It isn't. It's about faith, faith in systems, faith in tomorrow, faith in one another. And faith, unlike currency, cannot be printed. I open the window. The air smells of wet earth and new beginnings. The fields outside are quiet, but not still somewhere. A farmer has already begun his day. He doesn't know that the world's markets are anxious, that ratings have changed, that analysts debate soft landings. He only knows that the soil still answers to his hands. That is his economy. Watching him, I understand something simple yet profound. The world will not be saved by theories, but by continuance, by ordinary people who wake up and keep trying. Perhaps healing begins there, not with reform, but with rhythm. When I speak of awakening, I don't mean revolution. I mean awareness, the gentle kind that opens like dawn, not fire. It starts when we recognize how deeply connected we already are. Every purchase, every click, every vote is a thread. We've woven a planet sized web of dependence and forgotten that dependence is not weakness, it's relationship. To be human is to owe, to borrow breath from the trees, warmth from the sun, language from those before us. Debt, in its truest form, is gratitude. Somewhere along the way, we replaced gratitude with greed. We built temples of finance and called them freedom. But freedom without responsibility is just another form of chaos. The awakening, I think, is remembering the difference. I used to believe that stability meant certainty. Now I think it means trust the quiet agreement that even if tomorrow is uncertain, we will face it together. Look at the small gestures around you. A stranger returning a lost wallet, a teacher giving extra time to a struggling child, a doctor working past exhaustion. None of them change global GDP. Yet without them, the world collapses faster than any market crash. Perhaps this is the hidden reserve currency kindness. It appreciates when shared and loses value when hoarded. I think of the phrase, in God we trust, printed on the dollar. For years I saw it as irony. Now I see it as prophecy. Because in the end, all economies are acts of worship, not of divinity, but of belief itself. When we lose faith in each other, money becomes meaningless paper. When we rediscover trust, even scarcity can feel abundant. So maybe the challenge of our century is not paying off debt, but reimagining what we owe. We owe our elders respect. We owe our children a livable planet. We owe the strangers who build our phones, sew our clothes, harvest our food the courtesy of fairness. And we owe ourselves forgiveness for having forgotten all this. That is the balance sheet of the soul. As I watch the sunlight spill across the floor, I think about cycles, the heartbeat of capitalism, the rise and fall of empires, the endless motion of debt. We call it sustainability when the numbers line up. But true sustainability is emotional, the ability to hope again after disappointment, to trust again after betrayal. Maybe that's what healing looks like, not perfection, but the courage to stay gentle in a world that profits from hardness. I recall the first question that began this journey. If every nation is in debt, who is the lender? After all I've learned, I think the answer is this: we lend to ourselves. Each day we invest faith into the world, hoping it will return interest in the form of meaning. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't, but we lend anyway because the act of believing is what keeps us alive. That's the quiet miracle no market can quantify. Soon another crisis will come. Another chart will plunge. Another leader will promise rescue. But maybe next time we'll see it differently, not as apocalypse, but as reminder. A reminder that we can't separate economics from ethics, growth from gratitude, wealth from wisdom. I don't know if the world will change, but I know that I can, and maybe that's enough to begin. So I choose to live slower, to spend less but mean more, to measure success not in numbers but in peace of mind. Because the true wealth of a nation isn't its GDP, it's its capacity for empathy. And empathy, once awakened, is impossible to unlearn. The world still carries its debts. But today, as the light touches every roof, I feel something lighter too, a collective exhale. Maybe that's what redemption sounds like, the sigh of billions realizing they're still here. We've built our civilization on IOUs, yet the greatest debt we owe is to life itself for trusting us to continue. Let's repay it with care. I began this story chasing the mechanics of money. I end it humbled by the mechanics of love. Because after all the data and despair, what remains is astonishingly simple. We still believe in each other, even when we pretend not to. And as long as that belief endures, no crisis is final, no debt unpayable, no dawn too far away.